Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going deep, really deep into the Rohingya crisis.
Yeah, it's a tough one. Lots to unpack.
We've got articles, reports, even some firsthand accounts, really trying to get a handle on this situation.
Definitely complex.
So, to set the stage, we're talking about a Muslim minority group facing persecution in Myanmar, which has led to this huge, massive refugee crisis.
Right. And to understand it, I think we have to start with who the Rohingya people are.
Absolutely. It's more than just saying, oh, they're Muslims in a Buddhist majority country. Their Islam is really unique with all these Sufi influences.
Yeah, it's fascinating how that shapes their practices and beliefs.
Huh.
And speaking of names, even the term Rohingya is significant.
How so?
It's not just a label, it's connected to their claim to the land, their history going back centuries.
So you're saying the name itself carries a lot of weight?
Absolutely. You can't separate their identity from their history in the region. We're talking about roots going back to the 15th century in the Arakan Kingdom.
Wow, so they've been there for a long time. But here's where things get really complicated. Despite that long history, Myanmar denies them citizenship.
Exactly. And that's at the heart of this whole crisis.
It's unbelievable to me, like in the 21st century, a whole group of people can just be stateless.
Well, that's the reality for the Rohingya. You've got the 1982 citizenship law and then a whole bunch of other policies that basically stripped them of their legal existence.
So like overnight, they just became
Non-entities. Ghosts in their own homeland, really.
I was reading about these temporary ID cards they had, the white cards.
Yeah, those were revoked too in 2015. And even before that, in the 2014 census, they were pressured to identify as Bengali.
Like they're being told to deny their own identity.
Exactly. Imagine being told you can't even call yourself by the name that connects you to your ancestors, your history.
It's a systematic attempt to erase them. And it's not just on paper, right? It's impacting their lives every day.
Oh, absolutely. Their lives are controlled in almost every way imaginable. Restrictions on movement, marriage, even how many children they're allowed to have. It's like living in an open-air prison.
Yeah, I came across the two-child policy in my research, and it's just shocking.
It's a blatant attempt to control their population growth.
And this is all happening against a backdrop of extreme poverty, especially in Rakhine State, where many of them live.
Right. You've got poverty, religious tension, and then in 2017, things explode.
August 2017, right. That's when the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, RSA, attacked police and military posts.
It was a desperate act by a militant group, but the consequences were devastating.
The Myanmar military's response was brutal, to say the least. Just reading the accounts is gut-wrenching.
Entire villages were burned to the ground. We're talking about almost 700,000 people forced to flee for their lives.
Those numbers are just staggering. It's hard to even comprehend.
And the UN has called it ethnic cleansing, even using the term genocidal intent. Those are serious accusations.
And the UN fact-finding missions report is pretty damning. They documented systematic abuse by the military, killings, rapes, the whole 9 yards.
It paints a very grim picture. The level of cruelty is just unbelievable.
So where did all these people go? 700,000 people fleeing. It's hard to even fathom.
Imagine being in their shoes, running for your life with nothing but the clothes on your back. Where do you even start?
The sources describe Bangladesh as bearing the brunt of this exodus. They were already dealing with their own issues, and then
over 900,000 refugees ended up crammed into overcrowded camps, like Cox's Bazar. Disease outbreaks, limited resources. It became a humanitarian catastrophe.
It's just unimaginable the suffering they must have endured.
And it's not just Bangladesh. This crisis has spread across Southeast Asia and beyond. It's a global issue.
Right, we're talking about a Rohingya diaspora now. Nearly 100,000 in Malaysia, many living in the shadows without legal status.
You've got India pushing for repatriation, despite safety concerns raised by the UN. Thailand has become a transit point, which opens the door to all sorts of exploitation.
And even Indonesia, while they're trying to help, they're overwhelmed by the sheer number of refugees.
It's a crisis that's touched so many countries, and yet it often feels like it's happening in the shadows.
And then there's Aung San Suu Kyi. She was once seen as this icon of hope, a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. What happened?
It's a story that's left many people feeling disillusioned. Her response to the crisis has been met with widespread condemnation.
She denied the ethnic cleansing, defended the military's actions. It was a real blow to her international reputation.
Some argue that she's trapped between the military and international pressure, but for many, the damage is already done.
It makes you question the limits of power, the complexities of politics, and what happens when ideals clash with reality.
Yeah, it's a sobering reminder that even those who have fought for freedom can sometimes make choices They contradict their past.
So given all of this, how has the world responded? It seems like a mixed bag at best, right?
There have been some actions, like sanctions against Myanmar's military leaders from the U.S., Canada, the EU.
But the UN Security Council has been largely ineffective, mostly due to resistance from countries like Russia and China.
It just goes to show how geopolitics can complicate even the most dire humanitarian situations.
And while humanitarian aid has increased, it's still not enough to address the root causes of the crisis.
Exactly. We're talking about systemic discrimination and hate that need to be tackled head-on.
There is one glimmer of hope, though. Did you read about Gambia's lawsuit against Myanmar?
Yeah, that's the one at the International Court of Justice, right? It's a long shot, but pretty bold.
It is. They're accusing Myanmar of violating the UN Genocide Convention. It's a David and Goliath situation.
It at least shows that the fight for justice is still going on.
It sends a powerful message. But this is just one piece of a much larger puzzle.
So where do we go from here? What does the future hold for the Rohingya people? They're caught in this horrible limbo.
That's the million-dollar question. Repatriation is being discussed, but is it really safe for them to go back? And Bangladesh can't keep hosting this massive refugee population forever. It just feels like the world is struggling to come up with a real, lasting solution.
It is a challenge. We can't just put a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. We need a long-term plan that addresses the root causes, ensures their basic human rights.
A plan that guarantees their dignity and gives them a chance to rebuild their lives.
Absolutely, and that requires a global effort, a real commitment to justice and human rights for all. We can't let them be forgotten.
We've covered a lot of ground, but it feels like we've only scratched the surface.
There's so much more to unpack, especially the human side of this crisis. The psychological toll, the role of misinformation. These are things we need to explore further.
Stay with us as we continue this deep dive. We'll hear from the Rohingya people themselves, learn about their stories, their resilience, and what we can all do to make a difference.
It's easy to get caught up in the numbers. Almost 1 million refugees. But we have to remember, we're talking about real people.
Right. Each one of those 700,000 people who fled has their own story, their own trauma.
Exactly. And one thing that really struck me going through these sources was the role of misinformation.
Yeah, it's crazy how propaganda can be used to fuel this kind of hatred and violence.
It's like they're trying to rewrite history, portray the Rohingya as these outsiders, a threat to Myanmar's Buddhist identity.
I saw that a lot in the articles, this narrative that they're illegal immigrants, even though they've been there for centuries.
It's classic scapegoating, dehumanize the other, and suddenly violence becomes justifiable.
And social media just amplifies it all, spreads the hate like wildfire.
It's a scary trend, this rise of online hate speech and targeted misinformation. It's not just happening in Myanmar, it's everywhere.
So how do we combat that? How do we promote understanding and empathy when there's so much misinformation out there?
It's a tough question, but I think education is key. We need to share accurate information, challenge those harmful narratives whenever we see them.
Can't let hate speech go unchecked. Silence is complicity, right?
Absolutely. We all have a responsibility to speak up. And it's not just about individual actions. We need to hold those in power accountable too.
Speaking of accountability, it's hard not to think about Aung San Suu Kyi and how she's handled this.
It's a reminder that power can be corrupting, even for those who have experienced oppression themselves.
It's really shaken people's faith in her, in democracy itself. If she can't stand up for human rights, who will?
It raises some tough questions about the fragility of democracy, especially in a country like Myanmar, where the military still holds so much sway.
Okay, so we've talked about the history, the legal complexities, the humanitarian disaster, the spread of misinformation. But what can our listeners actually do about it?
I know it can feel overwhelming. Like, what difference can one person make?
Exactly. It's so easy to feel helpless when you see something this big and complex.
But there are things we can all do. Even small actions can have an impact. Supporting organizations working on the ground is a big one.
Like donating to NGOs, providing food, shelter, medical care to the refugees.
Exactly. Every little bit helps. And staying informed is crucial too. Read articles from reputable sources, follow organizations fighting for justice.
So educate ourselves and share that knowledge with others.
Right, because the more people understand what's happening, the more pressure we can put on those in power to make a change. And don't underestimate the power of your voice.
Like contacting our elected officials, signing petitions, participating in protests.
Exactly. Those things matter. Let them know that you care about the Rohingya people And you expect them to do more to help.
So it's about turning awareness into action, holding those in power accountable.
Yes. And remembering that this is a long-term struggle. It won't be solved overnight. But if we work together, amplify the voices of the Rohingya people, we can make a difference.
We can fight for a future where they are finally granted the rights and dignity they deserve.
Exactly. And speaking of dignity, there's one aspect of the Rohingya crisis we haven't touched on yet, and it's something that's really close to my heart.
Oh, I'm intrigued. What is it? You were saying there's an aspect of the Rohingya crisis we haven't talked about yet.
Yeah, the psychological impact. I mean, we've talked about the physical displacement, the violence.
Right. The loss of their homes, their livelihoods.
But what about the trauma? The invisible scars that they carry with them?
That's a really good point. Trauma can be so hard to see, but it's just as devastating.
Absolutely. Imagine the fear they lived with, the constant threat of violence seeing their loved ones.
Yeah, and some of the articles mention things like PTSD, depression, anxiety. Even among the children, it's heartbreaking.
And access to mental health services in the refugee camps is often very limited. It's a crisis within a crisis.
So how do we even begin to address that? It seems like such a complex issue.
Well, the first step is acknowledging it, right? Recognizing that trauma is a real and significant part of this crisis.
Okay, so we acknowledge it. Then what?
Then we have to provide support. Trauma-informed care, safe spaces for healing, empowering them to rebuild their lives.
Not just physically, but emotionally, too.
Exactly. True recovery goes beyond just basic needs. And that's something we can all contribute to.
How so?
By supporting organizations providing mental health services to Rohingya refugees. There are some amazing groups doing incredible work.
Right. It's about investing in their long-term well-being.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And on a broader level, we need to advocate for policies that protect the rights of all refugees.
So it's about addressing the root causes, the systemic discrimination that led to this crisis in the first place.
Yes, and that requires a global effort. It starts with each of us speaking out against injustice, challenging prejudice.
And demanding better from our leaders.
Exactly. We can't afford to be silent. This deep dive, it's been heavy, but it's been important.
We started with a simple question. Who are the Rohingya? And it's led us down this path of uncovering all these layers of complexity.
It's a story that's both heartbreaking and inspiring. The resilience of the Rohingya people is incredible.
I hope our listeners come away from this feeling informed but also empowered, like they can actually do something.
Me too. Even small actions can make a difference. Donating, staying informed, speaking out, all of it matters.
It's about turning awareness into action.
Exactly. And never giving up hope. The Rohingya people haven't, and neither should we.
Well said. That's a powerful message to end on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Rohingya crisis. We encourage you to keep learning, keep sharing, and find your own ways to make a difference. Until next time, stay curious and stay engaged.